The Women's Defense Network is dedicated to women's issues like domestic and sexual abuse. The mission is to help women find the resources they need for their issues. There's always another abused woman in the workplace, at home, etc. You can get the help you need. I'm Megan, and the motto is, no victims, fight back.
The world can be dangerous. Protect yourself. No victims. Fight back.
The husband is really being very charming and very sweet in ways which will be very attractive to most women. I think the important thing to note here is that actually there are no disturbing signs that you would see, and that one of the reasons why people from all walks of life, people who are intelligent, people who are educated, as well as people who come from more deprived backgrounds, from every single section of community, people find themselves in this situation. And it's because it's very difficult actually to identify signs. If it was easy, then there would be less people that would fall into that trap. But one of the signs is actually of this sort of very attractive, very charming, very charismatic person who, one could say with hindsight, really knows how to control a woman, knows how to make someone want to be loved by them.
So a question is often asked that could she have recognized an abuser before she actually married him? And there are some warning signs. Of course, they're never all there, and it's extremely easy to miss them. One of the things that may happen in some relationships is when the couple is engaged or when they first meet, the man shows an extraordinary amount of attention to the woman. He wants to know where she is at every minute of the day. He seems extremely possessive about her, and he wants her to spend all her time with her. And those could easily be mistaken for signs of caring or affection. But often, if it is to a degree which makes the woman feel uncomfortable, it could be a sign that the man will turn abusive later on. One rule of thumb to remember in a relationship in the early period, or when the couple is engaged, or when they first meet for the purposes of getting married, is to remember that the good that you see in a man may or may not last after the marriage, but the challenging qualities that you see in somebody are likely to get worse as the relationship goes on, which is, of course, everyone has qualities which are both good and not so good. The idea is to recognize what you can live with and to make a realistic decision based on that, because often young girls think that they will change this behavior in their future spouse. And like I like to tell the couples that I deal with is, please don't marry a project. What you see, if you're not happy with it, you need to be willing to live with what you see as you see it, because it may not get better.
And it's a shocking and traumatic situation. But what's even more shocking and traumatic than the situation itself is how the perpetrator, how the assailant really deals with that situation. that in this situation he's almost unapologetic initially, that he is responding nonchalantly and doesn't sort of really feel that his wife has a right to ask him where he's been. And this is very difficult because we all have ideas that, you know, we should be allowed to have our own freedom and that we shouldn't have to answer to anyone. But of course, in a caring relationship, you know, people do. We are accountable to each other. Yeah, and Allah says to us in the Quran, you know, beware of Allah by whom you demand the ties of your relationship. And what that really tells us is that there is a heart, a subtle transaction in the way that we are supposed to operate. We're supposed to be caring of each other. We're supposed to be attentive to each other. In this situation, it doesn't happen. And then what happens afterwards, you know, he's very sorry and apologetic. Now, in some cases that is very genuine. In other cases it's because he knows that this is a way of getting more control. You know, that he recognizes that this is a barrier that's been broken. So by being sorry and apologetic, it's part of the cycle of abuse that allows it to continue more, because of course his wife is very much hoping that this won't happen again. You know, in the early days, just married, you know, of course she doesn't want to believe that this could really be true, and wants to believe so much that he is sorry and apologetic. And perhaps he is too. You know, perhaps he is sorry and apologetic. But as we're about to see, that that situation continues and in fact escalates.
As the cycle of abuse continues, it's generally, the general trend is that the honeymoon period will get shorter and the period of tension build-up will get longer. The incidents of violence tend to get more extreme as time goes by. So contrary to what the woman might hope or believe will happen, it actually gets worse over time, is the general trend. And sometimes it gets to a stage, quite often it gets to a stage where the honeymoon period will pretty much disappear, and instead of that, after an incident of violence, there is more threats of violence, and there is that is how, instead, you know, initially the man will sort of keep the woman in check through the honeymoon period, right? Keep her engaged in the relationship. But when her sense of self or her sense of self-worth is so diminished, he doesn't need to do that anymore. Then all he needs to keep her in the relationship is threats of violence, either against herself or against the children, which is a very big way that he can keep control over the woman, or by harming her family or financial means. I mean, threats can take a whole, you know, many different forms. There has been a lot of research done on the fact that if people grow up in abusive relationships, if they have seen domestic violence at home, they are more than twice as likely to repeat that cycle of violence. So men who have seen their father abuse their mother are more likely to abuse their wife than men who have not seen this behavior at home. So in that sense, this cycle of violence is carried on from generation to generation. So it's all hope is not lost, because there are some people who grow up in such abusive homes and make the conscious decision not to behave like that, and they will take responsibility and take charge of their own of the history and not repeat it. But more likely than not, it does put a man at greater risk of abusing his wife if he has seen the same in his home.
Because I think what we see is perhaps something that we all recognize. You know, how we start to make excuses in ourselves because we really desperately are hoping that it's not the way that it actually is. And the way that this happens often in cases of intimate partner violence is that we sort of say, well, that wasn't so bad. This is really bad, but this doesn't happen so much. But the sort of the slaps, are happening maybe more frequently, and that's okay. And the reason we do that, or the reason that people who are in these situations do that, is because it's a survival mechanism. It's a coping mechanism. I can cope with this, but I can't cope with that. This means that it's a good day, this is an awful day. If it's a good day, I can continue, I can carry on, I can survive, I need to be strong. All those things that people in this situation tell themselves. And say that, perhaps he didn't mean it, because those apologies and those sorries that we saw previously, are still part of how we're trying to understand the makeup of this person. And again, in the early stages of a relationship, often not understanding perhaps what a relationship is supposed to look like. We know that we're supposed to understand that there's give and take in a relationship. And quite often people are in these situations say, well, maybe this is what give and take is supposed to be like. Maybe I did do something wrong. Maybe if I did things another way, I won't get hurt. So trying to strategize around something which is just wrong. And as I said, it's part of the coping mechanism. It's part of the way that we try and get through. Because if you believe that you have control over the situation, it makes you feel like maybe there's something you can do. To face the fact that maybe there's nothing you can do is terrifying, and it leads you to despair. And that, is a place that most people in these situations want to run away from, to contemplate that black hole of despair. Is really the most frightening thing. Is this really what this is? Is this really what this man is? Whether it's as a teacher, whether it's as somebody who commands respect by having people come to them for advice, whether it's because they do a lot of charity work, all of those ways which we respect and admire can also be ways to get and manipulate people. There are always two sides to every coin, and that's why Allah says, it's your niyat that counts, it's your intention. And often you can't tell. People who have this kind of psyche also at root, there is something underneath all of that. There is part of us which has the ability to witness. Allah says, you'll witness upon your own self even though you make excuses. So there's a part of us that always somehow knows. And so sometimes those people try to make up for it by being super religious or super spiritual. And they have often an emotional intelligence, so they know how to work it, but it's in a very negative way. And this is not to sort of say at all that people who are religious always have this other side to them, but it can be that they go together. It can be that. And that's quite hard. That's quite hard, because I think also we've created a community where there is a lot of hypocrisy, where we believe that it's enough to do those outward forms of ibadat. But actually, what about the inner? What about, how you are in this intimate situation when there's nobody watching? That's the most telling of all.
So again, domestic violence is not restricted to any social status, to any education level, or to any particular faith or culture. It is endemic in all areas, in all segments of the society. And this is important to remember, because we tend to think of it as if people are extremely religious or if people are very educated, it somehow means that they will not be violent. But unfortunately, that is not the case. Having said that, just in terms of percentage-wise, there are some segments of the population who do have a higher rate of being violent, and at certain times, for example, a younger woman between the ages of 24 to 35 is much more likely to experience abuse and violence in her relationship than an older woman.
What happens here is that the perpetrator is doing absolutely everything he can to weaken that person's power. So they think nothing of themselves, so that they lose the ability to act, so that all they're doing is trying to get back on an even keel, because all the power is increasingly being held and being taken.
Often the cycle of abuse actually weakens the woman's sense of self-worth. This is an extremely common outcome of being abused over a period of time, that it affects her self-confidence, her self-esteem, her sense of herself. She begins to doubt who she is, and she begins to question whether she did in fact do something to trigger the violence. And for this and many other reasons, women find it extremely difficult to break away from an abusive relationship.
This is an issue about power and control. And one of the ways that somebody can make a person feel like they have no power is by humiliating them. That men are just like that, and that as women we are trained in a way in our culture to sort of do everything we can to please and to work around how a man is. You know, that a man is entitled to be the way he is, but a woman needs to find ways of pleasing, appeasing, you know, stay out of the way, whatever it is. And what that does is makes a woman feel, well, this must be my fault. The response of the community and the family as well also makes her feel, you know, there's no way out of this. Everybody is saying to me, this is how I'm supposed to be. As a woman, you know, as somebody in our community, I need to stay here and make this work. Otherwise, I've failed. Otherwise, I have no respect. Otherwise, there's nowhere to go. No one will accept me or accept my story for what it is.
So the first thing is, I think that the way the communities can help manage this is through awareness and speaking out. It is an extremely difficult thing to speak up about, and it is because we tend to have extremely strong family values, and we really believe that we should try to make relationships work as much as we possibly can. But it is those very values which actually keep the violence a secret. And remember that the abuser and the abuse thrives in secret. So it is extremely important to speak out and to call it for what it is. So to name the abuse. It is not marital difficulties. It is not a question of a woman having more patience. It is not a question of a woman trying hard. Because there are many women who, you know, when they're going through this, they will seek counseling for themselves, and they will, you know, the criteria that they often make for themselves is extremely unrealistic. Because if a woman says, I'm willing to make this relationship work at all costs and I will never slip up again, it is the counselor's job to tell her that she is setting herself up for an impossible ideal. Because in every single relationship there will be times when we make mistakes and we mess up. So again, you know, when we are talking about abuse and people start trying to understand what happened in the relationship which led to the abuse, that's not the right question to ask. Because in every relationship there are times where people will trigger each other. That is a normal part of a relationship. However, it is not acceptable that when you slip up, you have the danger of being abused or having violence done to you.
So, trying to hold fast to the rope of Allah, trying to cling on to something when everything else is disappearing, your sense of self, who are you? If you're not a wife, if you're not in this, what you're supposed to be, if things are not how they're supposed to be, if you can't trust this person who is apparently religious, if you can't trust the community, if you can't trust everything around you, you don't even know what's going on, you can't even tell what's real and what isn't, then how are you supposed to believe? And yet, if you face that honestly, as has happened here, then I do believe with total certainty an answer comes, because Allah says, call on me and I will answer you. But that answer comes sometimes in ways that you don't expect. Sometimes it doesn't come from prayer or from a voice suddenly calling. It comes in the form of having a child.
Generally, women tend to, it's the instinct that Allah has put in the woman of protecting her children at all costs. So generally, it's not, it actually gives her renewed strength to leave. So that's usually when, when it comes down to the children and when they start getting abused is when most women will make the decision to leave the relationship.
No victims. Fight back.
The world can be dangerous. Protect yourself. No victims. Fight back.